Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Mark and Tasmina for this kind invitation. I was really surprised but honoured to be invited with all these highly distinguished guests. And I feel a little nervous, to be honest. I'm not normally nervous because I've been teaching for nearly 50 years. And the last thing you should be if you're a professor is nervous, but it is a different audience. As Tasmina says, I actually wear many hats, as you probably do as well, and I've just retired from the university, so I've just thrown that hat in the bin after 46 years. But she didn't mention one other hat that I wear, which is, I'm proud to say that I was very heavily responsible or involved in the creation of a Centre for African Research on Enterprise and Economic Development at our university in the west of Scotland. And I'm glad to say that it's now in a healthy condition. I'll say a little bit about trade in the context of that centre, as well as the Honorary Consul role, because I think there's a very strong overlap there. But our centre has a clear mission, which is to present a positive narrative about Africa, not a negative. There are plenty of others who present negative narratives about Africa, and that's not what we do. We're much more interested in the future than the past. We're interested in bridges, hospitals, infrastructure, education, and successful economies. Now, we don't gloss over the problems of Africa, but we have to say that is our main mission. And when it comes to talking about trade in Africa, where do you begin? There's 54 countries in Africa. They're all different. I've worked in about 7 or 8, I think now. Nigeria, Sierra Leone. I'm delighted that our Sierra Leonean colleagues are here. I spent 1 year teaching in the university there. I've worked in Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda. I'm missing one, Malawi, a little bit of work in Malawi. I think that's enough for me to have quite a good perspective on Sub-Saharan Africa, at least. I've never actually worked in North Africa, strangely enough, although our centre does cover North Africa as well. And it's a very vibrant centre with about 20 academics. The vast majority are African. I'm one of the exceptions. 2 or 3 of us are Scottish or British. So it's in the context of that. And to talk about trade in Africa at a time when trade is under threat in the world. Now, I hate the term Trump tariffs. I hate alliterations like that. It's US tariffs that have been imposed in this rather garish way that Donald Trump presented, a bit like a bouquet at the Ascot Racehorse when they had the big sign saying, these are the tariffs, we'll bet on this, bet on that. And many of the tariffs were imposed in African countries, even countries that the US has very little trade with. The country that comes to mind is Lesotho, which is in the southern part of Africa, which depends heavily on migrant workers. We were speaking about migration earlier, contributing to foreign exchange earnings. And I was going to say Professor Trump, but President Trump imposed, I think it was a 50%, 60% tariff on Lesotho. It's meaningless because there's very little trade between Lesotho and the US. Just to give that example. Now, the complex nature of African economies is even more complicated than the EU. We've been discussing the EU today. Many people probably don't even know that an African continental free trade area has been established across the 54 countries about 4 or 5 years ago. How many people did know that in the audience? I'm really shocked that you didn't know there was an African continental free trade area established. I'll try again. How many people did hear about it before I've mentioned it? I'm sure you did. But it's very surprising and a little shocking that you haven't heard that. Now this makes the EU look tiny because it's a population of 1.4 billion in this free trade area. And while the rest of the world seems to be moving away from free trade because of this tariff environment that we're in now, Africa is setting an example to the world And it's a very ambitious project in Africa because it's also about infrastructure as much as it is about trade. But it is the future. Economists love trade. You see, I think I described my talk as a sort of bridge between other developments. You know, we can establish trade links, and that can lead to cultural links as well. And I'll give you some example in relation to the work I do for Ethiopia. I'll go on to that now because, as Mina said, in 2015 I was shocked that time as well to be asked to be the Honorary Consul for Ethiopia. Probably because, as an economist, I did a lot of research on the coffee sector in Ethiopia. Quite boring, econometric, statistical work on how important coffee is to the Ethiopian economy, and it still is very important. But when we did our research 10 or 15 years ago on that subject, coffee to Ethiopia represented more than 60% of all its foreign exchange earnings. That's an unsustainable situation, especially with volatility in coffee prices. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a lecture on technical economics, but a country that depends so heavily on one commodity is always going to be fragile and volatile. I'm pleased to say, and it's not just because of the research that we did, that dependency on coffee is much reduced. It's still in the high 40%. The economy of Ethiopia has diversified, quietly actually. And this is a key point, I think, for many in the audience, that I was saying to my Sierra Leonean friends yesterday that it's very good that Sierra Leone is not in the news at the moment, because often the only time that African countries are in the news when it's a conflict or a crisis or a famine and so on. And if we think of the theme of this conference, it's very belittling, isn't it, of the West and the North to be constantly negative about Africa. How would we like to be constantly criticised by African countries? We wouldn't like it, and we shouldn't do it all the time. I know it's the media that whips this up, but it's the role of academics and politicians like yourselves and diplomats to change that narrative. So in my role as the Honorary Consul, I've been trying, unsuccessfully so far, to develop a trade mission to Ethiopia. Now you might think, well, what are the relationships between Scotland and Ethiopia? They're not that strong, to be honest. But if it hadn't been for the COVID pandemic, I'm sure we would have had one by now. And then, at the time when I was trying to develop a trade mission, there was, of course, the Tigrayan War about 4 or 5 years ago, which was a disaster for the country of Ethiopia. At the highest rate of economic growth just prior to that war in the world, higher than China, but albeit from a very low base. And the steps forward, and there's a period of peace at the moment overall in the country, and I know there are issues there which we can talk about, and I stay away from politics, I must admit. It's hard enough to deal with economics. It's hard. Economics is hard. The trade-offs, it's all about least bad options in economics, isn't it? Least bad options. I think we Scots are quite suited to dealing with least bad options. But I've been working heavily with the embassy in London, with the Ethiopian community here in this regard, and also with organisations that develop trade links with Africa. It's difficult in Scotland because a lot of these issues are reserved to Westminster. But there are quite active groups. There's a group called the Scottish Africa Business Association, and they're planning a trade mission to Kenya and Angola in early 2026. I'm hoping to add Ethiopia to that next year. Two quick points about the nature of the Ethiopian economy that you may not know. Just in a few weeks, if not days, they're about to open this massive hydroelectric dam on the Blue Nile. It's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It costs nearly $6 billion to build. It's between 5 and 6 gigawatts of power. It will liberate the lives of 30 to 40% of Ethiopians who don't currently have any electricity. The electricity will be exported to other countries in Africa. And we have to remember that Africa doesn't sit there waiting for the West to do trade with it all the time. The African Continental Free Trade Area is about intra-African trade, of which there's too little at the moment. And I'm sure my colleague from Sierra Leone is nodding in agreement there. And so there are great opportunities for trade links with the UK generally, but also with Scotland. And this is something that we're trying to develop as we go along. And if we look at the different sectors, I'm trying to do a sort of matching of sectors, like the food and drink sector in Ethiopia is quite strong. You'd be surprised how many different beers they have in Ethiopia. It's about 15. They have a thriving textile industry. This Thai is Ethiopian, and this is the Ethiopian language here, alphabet. And there's such a lot, there is potential there, including power engineering, renewable energy, and we've been trying to develop these links with universities and other agencies such as the Chamber of Commerce. During the pandemic, we had several Zoom meetings with the Chambers of Commerce here and the Chambers of Commerce in Ethiopia. And it may surprise you to know that the Chambers of Commerce in Ethiopia are a really vibrant organization. So that is our link with Ethiopia through the private sector, through the Chambers of Commerce, and so on like that. And then just finally, I want to say that if you haven't been to Ethiopia, it's a very unique country in Africa, never colonized, and they're very proud about that. There was the Italian incursion in the 1930s, which was stood down by Ethiopia and British as well. And so they're very proud of their history, proud of their heritage, the history of their religion, and the fact that they've got a different calendar from the rest of the world, different alphabet. It sometimes can be an impediment to trade. And as a hard-nosed economist, I'm often meeting the ambassador and saying, look, culture's fine, but we need to have food on the table, so we need to get that balance, and I think we're getting there now because the economy is beginning to open up a little bit. It's becoming more privatized and more market-friendly. And when I meet the ambassador, and it's probably because I'm a Glaswegian, we're quite direct, I have to say to them, look, ambassador, and I'm on my 5th ambassador now, you have to help me to help you, because I have good contacts in Scotland, and I want to develop a trade mission. One little anecdote before I finish. I was talking to Kenny McCaskill earlier about the Scottish diaspora around the world. And by the way, the African diaspora plays a big role in economic development in Africa. But I took a previous ambassador to, I think it was Hamza Yusuf when he was the International Development Minister a few years ago. And they told him about a famous Scot from Falkirk, Larbert to be exact, called James Bruce. He was a traveller in the late 18th century, and he travelled from Egypt through Sudan down to the Blue Nile, and he's known to be the first European to discover the source of the Blue Nile, and he's sort of worshipped in Ethiopia because when the ambassador came, have you heard of James Bruce? I've heard of Jack Bruce in what was the band called again? Jack Bruce was in Cream, wasn't he? The Scottish guitarist in Cream. I haven't heard of James Bruce, but he is renowned in Kenya. Not in Kenya, but in Ethiopia. And it shows you that culture plays a part, doesn't it, in trade. And trade plays a part in culture as well. And the two are complementary and not at odds with each other. And as we often say in an African context, usually after a very long speech, with those few words, I will end here. Thank you.